Hello, this is Bobby. It's been a while since I've done one of these live broadcasts, but I just wanted to try it out again, and I have nothing planned, nothing really planned to talk about per se. I do want to talk about, though, um, maybe the state of Reformed theology as I see it, especially online, as I experience that online, and then I do want to talk a little bit about the doctorate that I've gotten from Concordia Academic Theology Consortium International out in Puerto Rico, and talk a little bit about that and just maybe some other random stuff. And if anybody comes to watch me here on YouTube, you can post comments and maybe I'll respond to those as well if you have any questions for me or any things you want to talk about, discuss with me about theology in particular, then that would be great. So I don't anticipate, this is a weird time of day to do this, middle of the day on a Tuesday. So I don't anticipate any viewers right now. But you'll be able to watch this later on my YouTube channel where it's streaming through live, I think through StreamYard it's supposed to be anyway. So I guess to get started, I'm going to talk about the doctorate a little bit, how that all unfolded, where it came from, and just a little bit of background on all of that. So for me, I don't know, I've thought a lot about getting a PhD for years, and if this finally happened, not in the way I had anticipated or expected, but it is what the Lord seemed to provide in that vein. So so January 2022, I, out of the blue, received word from somebody I follow on Facebook and somebody who follows me on Facebook and had for quite a few years at that point, Dr. Enrique Ramos. And I didn't realize he was a dean of an entire Lutheran denomination, but he is. And they have a academic institution to train, a pastoral institute to train pastors for ordination. And then I think it's now as of a couple of years at this point, so it'd been a year when he contacted me. So as of a couple of years, he had established along with Dr. Fred Maina Makaria out of Kenya, they had established this consortium. And it's a consortium made up of 4 different seminaries in Puerto Rico, Kenya, Brazil, and South Africa. And they're small schools. Some are online, others they meet physically. So there's variance there. But so anyway, the consortium was established, I think, about 2 years ago. And so based on that and based on their capacity, their ability to grant degrees or honorary degrees even, that's what happened. I was surprised, actually. And they wanted to honor me with an honorary THD degree, a Doctor of Theology degree. So they gave me that in January of 2022, and I was shocked by that. And so I looked into them further, found out more about them, about their background, and and I was just, it was very encouraging to me. So that put them on my radar in that way. I knew Enrique, but I didn't know his background like that. So that put them on my radar, and so I started looking at them further, and started talking to them pretty quickly about maybe doing a PhD, if that was possible, with them. And so they were like, yes, absolutely. And so that started to unfold, and it was kind of a growing process for me along with them during that time, because, I want it to be credible. I want a credible degree. I don't want a degree from a degree mill or something like that. So I did a lot of research into their background and the various schools standing behind the consortium itself, who are involved with the consortium. And so, after working through that, and all along that time, I was putting together this PhD. I wasn't sure if I was going to actually write a brand new dissertation or try to do what is called a PhD by prior publication. And so that's what I ended up doing. I mean, I've already done decades of work on evangelical Calvinism, had 2 published, co-edited, co-authored books on the subject, had been engaged with in the literature. So that sounds really like elitist almost to say it like that, but it was engaged in the academic theological literature, our work on evangelical Calvinism, my work, and Mike Havitz's. And so there was warrant to do something like that we'd offered, like an original contribution to the academic theological literature in the area of what we call, after Thomas Torrance, evangelical Calvinism. And so it's an original offering. It's an original identification of something that has been present within the history of Reformed theology from its very inception, really, as far as a mood goes. And so, so that's what happened. There was some things that needed to be dealt with as far as some of the institutional stuff. And that was, and so Concordia, actually, they had years prior, even before Concordia, but as far as their pastoral institute had already, by word of mouth, really, as far as I know, received like that they could legally award ecclesiastical degrees up to the doctorate. And that legality was granted to them by the Department of Education in Puerto Rico, which is corollary with the Department of Education in the United States of America. So, but that had to be hashed out further as far as, so not just word of mouth or not just from the past. So that was something that I was kind of waiting on too, for that to all unfold. And so Dr. Ramos, Enrique, he worked through that process during the time I was putting together this PhD by prior publication, and was able to make sure that was all right, all legal, and that they are allowed in concert. And I can't even pronounce in Spanish right now, or I don't recall it in Spanish right now, but they partnered with what basically is kind of like an accrediting body organization in Puerto Rico for schools in Puerto Rico in particular, to give them the legal capacity to award these ecclesiastical degrees. And so Enrique knew somebody. He knew the president, the head of that organization, and they worked through the process and it became legal. And so at that point, I felt good about that, about going forward with it. And as far as the actual accreditation, it's not accredited by, ATS or something like that. But as far as its accreditation, it's accredited by the General Lutheran Church. So it's validated, however you want to say that. Just like divinity degrees are validated, accredited by the Church of Scotland for any divinity school in Scotland, like at Aberdeen or others. So in principle, it's the same thing. It's not exactly parallel, but in principle, that is the same thing as far as accreditation. It's just that this only has 2 years behind it as far as an institution, whereas Aberdeen or places like that have hundreds of years behind them. So So anyway, that's kind of like how that all unfolded, and I submitted it, the dissertation, so which included my personal chapters and other parts that I contributed personally to our edited books. So that made up the heft of my dissertation that I gave to them, and showing how it contributed in the literature to in the academic theological literature. So just kind of demonstrating that it did offer an original contribution in that area, and so it has been engaged with in various publications and by some high profile theologians out there. I mean, that's kind of how that works. And so I gave that to them. I think it was probably September. And so my examiners were Enrique Ramos internally, and then Dr. Fred Macaria, who'd be considered like the external examiner. They examined it. They do it based like on a South African type model or even Australian model. So it wasn't like I did a live Viva with them, where I had to defend it like that. But so they just read through it, and they gave it a pass with high honors from their perspective. So that's how that all happened. That's how that all came about. And so they awarded me the Doctor of Philosophy in Systematic and Historical Theology, October 15th, 2022. So that is what it is. It's not prestigious. It's not, it's not Aberdeen. It's not Oxford. It's not Cambridge. It's not even the Southern Baptist Seminary. It's a Concordia Academic Theology Consortium International. So it is what it is. It allows me to be, at some point, maybe a professor in their system. And that's something we've talked about and probably will happen at some point. And so there was that aspect of it to it as well. And so we need to, and I'm still working on that with them. It's hard, and it's still a brand new institution, essentially. So they're still working out as far as the masters and PhDs go. I was like the first one, not out of like Fred's school in Kenya. They've awarded many PhDs and THDs over the years, since they've been in existence since 2009. So still relatively new as well. But and their school in Kenya, I forget the guy's name now. His first name is Muhammad, but he has his doctors were out of the University of Berlin, and then he came back to his homeland in Kenya and started, let's call it International Faith. Actually, I think it's International Faith Theological Seminary. I think that's what it's called. So he established that. He also established a liberal arts college as well, alongside with that. And so there was that part of it, and then they kind of made the seminary distinct, like a divinity school in a way, kind of that model from the liberal arts school. So that's where Fred is at, Dr. Macaria. And but yeah, they, as part of the consortium, they have produced PhDs on the African continent, yeah, and it has content to it. So that it's not like there were no PhDs awarded to this consortium previously, at least by the schools who make the consortium currently. But I was the first one out of Puerto Rico. So it is what it is. It's in its infancy still. I'm excited to be associated with those guys. They love the Lord. Yeah, we don't agree fully on various theological issues, but we're of the same spirit in the Holy Spirit. So they love the Lord. They're ministering to people who are economically oppressed, destitute, in basically the third world countries, so-called developing countries. And so, yeah, I'm excited, just and honored and humbled to be, to have disassociation with them that way, and that they spent the time with me, almost a year, to do the doctorate. And a lot of these PhD by prior publications, even at prestigious institutions like Cambridge and elsewhere, who do that, a lot of those are completed in 6 months because the work's already done. So it's just a matter of bringing it together and having the examination done, just going through that process. And that's what I went through with them. So yeah, that is what it is. So I'm thankful for that. It's, I'm looking up at the diploma right here, along with my bachelor's and master's degrees from Multnomah, and it's just, I'm honored by it. I'm thankful for it. So thank you, Doctors Enrique Ramos and Fred Macaria, once again for working with me like that and allowing me to be associated with you guys in edifying the body of Christ and hoping to do that with you guys more. So I look forward to that in days to come. So there's that. That's my little talk on the doctorate. And so let me talk a little bit about the state. Let's transition here and talk a little bit about the state of Reformed theology. And I'm just going to feed off of what I've been seeing ongoing, particularly in Twitter, which really isn't a good representation, but it does have or provide a kind of representation of the people who are involved, I guess, at least online and behind the scenes, in the development of Reformed theology today. So, and if you're on Twitter, you know what I'm talking about as far as how that's all expressed there. It's not the best platform or medium, like we know, to talk about deep theological issues, right? So it is what it is. But I'm going to feed off of that a little bit. I'll talk a little bit now about Craig Carter, Matthew Barrett in particular, and this whole Thomist recovery. So recovering Thomas Aquinas's theology for Reformed theology and for its resurgence, I guess, is one word they've used, and revival, maybe, which would be an ironic way to use revival, but just their work in retrieval, their theology of retrieval, and how there's kind of this inner kind of debate between the Reformed Baptists and it's kind of internecine between them, between these Baptists. Really, it's not really the federal like the Presbyterians and stuff. Like they're not really involved with that, other than critiquing some of what's going on in that Baptist realm, in particular in the Reformed aspect of that realm. So you have Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, where Barrett's at. You have Craig Carter. He's out in Toronto, I think. And he's in Canada. Anyways, he might be in Vancouver, actually. But he's somewhere in Canada. And you have other people who are pushing that. So I just want to talk about that and how it's kind of a novelty. It seems like it's a novelty for a lot of these guys, for Barrett, for Carter. And, Carter's an older guy, so he's been around for a while. He says he went through a Bart phase in his past. And as I've seen him talk about Bart, I don't really know what he understands about Bart's theology. It's not accurate. He misrepresents him all the time. So there's that part of it where I critique Carter and some blog posts and things on Bart's theology and how he misrepresents him as this modernist. Like he doesn't, like, Bart's just modern, and so anything modern is demonic and evil, and it's Kantian or something, or Hegelian, and so we need to just trash it and go back to Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, right? So that's kind of like what Barrett and Craig Carter are about. They're about bringing us back to Thomistic orthodoxy, which is interesting, but it's not new. So, and I think this is so then you have people like James White. So I'm just going stream of consciousness, obviously, but then you have people like James White and that whole like John MacArthur, those kind of guys, the Macites, I like to call them. They're pushing back at Barrett and on Strachan too. Owen Strachan, I think that's how you say his last name, Strachan. So Strachan, White, J. Macites, John MacArthurites, they're pushing back against Barrett and Carter and that whole movement among some of these Southern Baptists, these Southern Baptist guys who are trying to recover the tradition, right? The consensus fidelium, the consensus patrum, as if there's just one monolithic stream of that, which consensus would seem to imply, but it's not really that simple either. So anyway, it just, for me, I've been thinking about this at least since 2002 with this whole influence of Thomas Aquinas, Aristotelian categories on the development of Reformed theology. And it seems to me like people like Matthew Barrett, I keep mentioning him because he's the most, I guess, high profile or one of the most outspoken ones online, especially through his Credo magazine and podcast. And then Craig Carter on Twitter. He says a lot of stuff on Twitter, makes lots of assertions and things like that on there about this whole thing. But it just seems like to me, like, especially Matthew Barrett, because he's younger, I guess he's my age. I'm 48. He's around my age. But it just seems like he just became aware, of this, of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle's impact on the development of Reformed theology. And so it just seems like there's this novelty, there's this honeymoon thing going on. But if you've studied the history of Reformed theology for any amount of time, and you've read Mueller, which I've read Richard Mueller a lot ever since 2002, and since seminary. And so if you've read him and other people like him, like David Steinmetz, who is Mueller's teacher, supervisor, Dr. Vader, you've read Heike Obermann, you've read people, Van Asselt, I don't think I said his name right, but that whole, like that's the Dutch side, the Dutch Reformed side, literally from the Netherlands. If you've been involved in this world for any amount of time, it's not, Thomas Aquinas isn't like, that's not a novelty. It's not like, oh, like you're surprised that there's this history there. And that seems to be what's going on with these guys, especially Carter and Barrett and that whole ilk, where they're recovering Aquinas. But really it's not, that work's already been done. That's not new. Richard Mueller. So I've read his 4 volumes, Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics. It took me a couple of years or maybe 3 years or so over time to work through it. And then I've read like a lot of his other stuff before that. And so, I mean, and that was completed years ago, right? So it just is, I just find it's almost kind of like quaint that these guys are just becoming aware that the Reformed theology has a heritage. I mean, I think that's good that they've become aware of that, because then it allows people like me to come on and critique them with more substance, And so in my background, I attempted years ago in a blogosphere starting in 2005, to offer some sort of critique and pushback against the Macites, John MacArthur followers, and his executive producer for his Grace to You show, Phil Johnson, and Phil's also been his book editor for years as well, decades. He had a popular blog called The Pyromaniacs, and so it's bloggy stuff. But yeah, I would go in there and challenge them all the time and try to make them aware of what Barrett and Carter are aware of now and are trying to let other Baptists know, that Reformed theology, the 5 points of Calvinism, which isn't the full representation either of Reformed theology, of course. It's very specific and occasional in its development. But that's what the MacArthurites and the James White type people have. That's the very essence, the very basis of their type of Reformed theology. It's just a 5-point Calvinism in abstraction from the federal theology, the covenantal theology that stands behind it. Now, James White's kind of sliding more into the covenantal world, but he's still, these guys, White, MacArthur, et al., and others in that realm are, they're pushing back against Barrett and Carter in particular, and on this idea that Thomas Aquinas had any effect on the development of Reformed theology. It's like they cannot accept that. So their fundamentalism, I guess, and I'd be considered a fundamentalist still theologically, even as somebody who thinks after Karl Barth, right? In the broader theological world, Barthians are considered fundamentalists if you're actually a Barthian. So in that sense, I'm even on that I'm on that fundamentalist spectrum as well. But they're genuine, like, what, 19th, 20th century, turn of the 20th century fundamentalists, right? In that sense, like, they're hyper literalist and they're pure biblicists, and they don't seem to, they're presuppositionalists when it comes to apologetics, things like that. But they cannot fathom that Aristotle, a philosopher, stands behind their theology. They will not accept that. And so, of course, they're coming at Barrett and Carter and that whole realm in Baptist theology. Southern Baptist theology really is what it is now. That whole quarter of Baptist theologians who are excited about this idea that, oh man, Thomas Aquinas is great, like that. Like, they're excited about that. And James White, MacArthur, and those guys, Strachan, they're just basically your biblicist, fundamentalist, 5-point Calvinists who think very abstractly, as if their 5 points of Calvin just fell out of heaven, right? And as a friend of mine, he's English, but in Scotland, and a professor of theology, historical theology, and church history, has told me and reminded me, there is a strain, of course, in Reformed Baptist theology in particular, that attempts to distance itself from this kind of post-Reformed orthodoxy. So, like with Machen and maybe Warfield and Hodge. So the original, like, OG Princetonians, there's kind of like this move away, apparently, and then you get to Van Til, from this kind of reliance upon the Thomists and Thomism. But to me, that's kind of, it's good that they don't want to be associated with Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. From my perspective, I don't want that either. But then it's almost like they just fall into this, like, this naked scripture approach, this scripture all by itself, not sola, but solo scriptura. So they do fall into that. And it's very to me, it's like kind of naturalistic. It's ironically rooted in kind of like an anti-supernaturalistic seedbed as far as its historical development, where that kind of biblicism comes from. It actually comes from, like, the text critical school, history of religion school. Like, it's just this kind of scientific approach to scripture minus confessionalism, right? And so that's kind of where these guys are at, though. There is that kind of naked biblicist stream. But from my perspective, if you're going to say that you're holding to the 5 points of Calvinism, again, that doesn't develop in a naked biblicism. It comes from the canons of Dort, and of course, the 5 points those were developed as the 5 points, like the tulip, like we know it today, in the 20th century. So that's a later, but it's a kind of a codification and a way to remember the points that were developed and argued for at through the canons of Dort. And so But that's that. So there's like this kind of like dissonance, I guess, that's going on for these guys, for the Mackites, the White James Whites, and people like that. That they continue to dig in their heels and say that reformed their kind of reformed theology is just straight out of the Bible. And so, like this kind of argumentation it's like naive or something. It's facile. It's too simplistic. But if you try to argue with them, like I did argue also not too long ago on Twitter, which isn't the best place to argue, of course, because you can't develop your thoughts very well there. There's not enough space, and it's just too soundbited. But that doesn't stop me. And so I tried to engage with James White's right hand man. I think his name is Rich, and he produces James White's broadcasts. And so I tried to engage with him, but it was the same type of thing. It's like he'd never even the thought that Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle had, that Aristotle's categories had been used in his reception through the post-reform Orthodox reception of Thomas Aquinas, right, and his synthesis, and just and of course they're not fully receiving Thomas Aquinas unmediated. Like they're even the post-reform Orthodox are receiving him, so they're receiving him in a constructive way. But what does stand behind their development of a doctrine of God, for example, is the Aristotelian categories. When you start talking about impassibility, immutability, all the omni theology, so God's omniscience, omnipresence. I forget which ones I just said, but the omnis, right? So they have that. That's all present, and that comes from a philosophical understanding, a Greek philosophical understanding of God, right? And so you don't get. I like to try to point out to people like Rich, White's right-hand man, and the Mackites, that you don't get to the 5 points of Calvinism. You don't get to the canons of Dort. You don't get to any of that. You don't get Arminius. You don't get the Remonstrance. You don't get any of that without Aristotelian categories, without scholastic categories. And so I think it's just an interesting combine, I guess, among that's happening with these Baptists. They're not, so you have like the Southern Baptists, like your Reformed Baptists, like London. That's what Carter is. He's Reformed Baptist. He's not, I don't think he's Southern Baptist per se. I don't know. I know he's Baptist, but he's working under the London Baptist Confession of Faith. And so then James White says he does too. So there's just a lot of confusion in that realm on the development and history of Reformed theology. And so from that perspective, Reformed theology to me is it's kind of on that side of it, it's kind of it's a hot mess right now. Still, and none of that will ever be resolved. Like James White and MacArthur, Strachan, they're just going to keep doing their biblicism, right? And this Rich guy, to finish that, he ended up blocking me. And I wasn't being mean either. I was just trying to point out to him, that he needs to read Richard Muller and get some history on his 5 points of Calvinism. So they just won't, they'll never accept that. So I've accepted that those guys will never acknowledge that that's the background. There's philosophy behind their doctrine of God, and it's pretty unevangelized philosophy. So I think that's really the problem. So a lot of people will say, so here, I'm just rambling. So thank you for my 3 viewers right now. A lot of these people will, like Carter and Barrett and those guys now, and then you have Michael Allen, Scott Swain. They're on the Presbyterian side nowadays. Their background, I think, both of them are Southern Baptists too, but they're now Presbyterian. But they're of course, they like Thomas Aquinas. They like the Aristotelian the Thomas synthesis, and they like the Christian Aristotelianism, as Richard Muller calls it. So they're all for that, and they try to tie that back in to as if that's just part of this monolithic stream of development that started back, in the ecumenical church councils with the patristics, and they just see themselves as part of that. They're in continuity with that, and so they try to make that argument. But I think they fail at that, because scholasticism is distinct. It's a distinct development in the history of theological development in the church from what was going on at the Council of Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon. It's just there's some different ways, of course, that these guys are approaching things from a Latin development after Aristotle, right? And I'm not saying that Aristotle didn't have any impact on, the early church either, and among the ecumenical councils. But I would argue, and I'm not going to do it here, but I would argue that the patristics did a better job of evangelizing a metaphysic, right? Evangelizing whatever metaphysics in a kind of like I like to say it, non-correlationist type of way. So I think they did a better job of identifying, okay, this Greek philosophy that they were ensconced in, they were saturated with. They recognized it for what it was, but they were able to abstract it in a way, the language, and then allow revelation, God's self-revelation in Christ, to really forge the way that they attempted to utilize that language when they talked about the Trinity, when Tertullian introduced the language of Trinity. And as that became more developed, I think they did a better job, and a different kind of a job, of evangelizing the metaphysics that they were working with versus what happens in the scholastic period. Because in my view, the scholastic period becomes kind of like a flaming Aristotelian way of developing theology, Christian theology. And I don't think, and the synthesis becomes driven by speculative ways of thinking about God, like a philosopher would do, versus what I think happened in the patristic period was driven way more, like when Irenaeus and Athanasius, from a biblical categorical way of thinking, trying to think about God, like Athanasius, that we know God as a father of the Son more than we know him through his works, right, in creation. I'm just paraphrasing that. And then you get to Aristotle, though, or not Aristotle, you get to Thomas Aquinas and his synthesis of Aristotelian categories with his way of doing theology and his scholastic synthesis. And he flips that kind of biblical categorical approach, flips that on its head, and allows the philosophical categories to take the lead and to drive the way that he then attempts to articulate God and a doctrine of God in his development of Christian theology. So to me, that's why there isn't continuity, because there's a methodological distinction between the way that Aristotle, or I keep saying that, between the way Thomas and, say, Irenaeus and Athanasius and Cyril developed their thinking on who God is triune, is Father of the Son. That's revelational. That's starting with the Son of the Father. That presupposes that. It doesn't start with a philosophical monad that, like we get with Thomas Aquinas. So, and then that, of course, Thomas is received, like I was talking about, into the development of Reformed orthodoxy, so-called. And that's why Richard Muller, in his work, calls that whole period Christian Aristotelianism. So I like to keep pressing that, because, and that's really just for James Whites and the MacArthurites and those types of people out there who can't see, they'll never acknowledge that. And you can't do anything with that then. So it's kind of like a waste of time after a while to keep trying to beat that drum with them. But yeah, I think that so for me then on this part of it, and this is where I'm Baptist. I grew up Baptist. I'm a conservative. I'm the son of a conservative Baptist pastor, the CBA it used to be called. And that's my background. So that's why I'm attuned to some of this stuff still. I'm not like mainline Christian. I'm not mainline Presbyterian or anything like that. So I'm still Baptistic. I'm Credo Baptist, like Bart. But I was Credo Baptist before I knew about Bart. So yeah, that's just how I grew up, right? But I've tested that now. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that exegetically and theologically, etc., church history of interpretation. And so I'm still Baptistic even after all of that. So that's why I still focus on the Baptists, my Baptist brothers and sisters, because even though I don't swim in the same stream as them theologically, really, other than on like in principle on baptism, other than that, and I'm Congregationalist, church government wise, still like free church, low church that way. So there's some resonances left between me and them. And so, yeah, that's just been my culture, my subculture, and that's why I pay attention to them still. And I still have friends who are deeply influenced by John MacArthur, by James White, at that level. So that's not academic, of course, right? But it doesn't matter. I think that's something that kind of bothers me, and that's why even this doctorate I got, it's not prestigious. It's not like high end, academic. Like it doesn't get me into the guild necessarily, and I'm totally fine with that. I'm fine with that. So I'm really more of a church guy, ultimately. And I'm interested in the Church of Jesus Christ. I'm not saying academic theologians aren't per se, but I think you probably, if you have any exposure to that world, you know what I'm talking about, that there is a disconnect between those worlds oftentimes, even if they say they're doing their work for the church, the academics. But so that's where I focus. That's why I've written so much in the past. I'm kind of tired of the whole MacArthurite James White thing. It's a waste. Ultimately a waste of time. But there has been fruit there for me personally through my blog over the years. I've had lots of pastors contact me who were under the influence of MacArthur. Like their church was a Mackite type church. They'd go to Shepherd's Conference. Yeah. Hey, John. Nice to hear from you. Yeah, me too. I'm more interested in some of these things pastorally as well. I'm kind of wired academically, I guess, but that's never been my motivation. So, but yeah, that's kind of where my heart has been always, is to help. Like I was just saying, I've gotten a lot of emails from pastors over the years who have told me that my engagement with the MacArthurites, with the Whiteites, whoever else in that realm, has helped them. It's helped them come out of that whole world, to help them to see God in a new light, in a way that they find refreshing and biblical. And so that has that encourages me to continue on still. For people like that, there's pastors out there who influence lots of other people. So I feel like that's kind of like a ministry in a way the Lord has given me to help, through work and research and reading that I do, it can potentially help pastors. And that's really what gets me excited, to continue to do this kind of stuff and to help encourage people and to let them know that there's a history, actually. I think that's something that for me, going into seminary, the Lord used historical theology actually to save me. Like I struggle with anxiety. I haven't been shy about that on my blog. That's been a spiritual, there's spiritual attack associated with that for sure. But I've struggled a lot with that. And I used to struggle a lot with doubts about God's existence coming out of undergrad. I went the kind of the apologetics. See, I'm going stream of consciousness still, but I went the apologetics route, the philosophical route, and it left me. But I was a Bible reader. That's really, I read through the Bible at least a couple times, 3 times a year, and have for 25 some years now at this point. And I had already started that when I started Bible college. And so the theology I was getting in Bible college was very philosophically, evangelically oriented that way, had that kind of reformed kind of background too. But it left me feeling dry and empty. And so when I got to seminary and I started taking historical theology classes, Reformation class, patristic theology class, and was mentored directly by the professor who taught those classes. Eventually, I did teaching fellowships for him eventually. But that whole realm, historical theology, changed my life way more than apologetics. It left me dry. It left me with a God who was impersonal. And there's corollary between the God of apologetics and the God of the philosophers, and the God who ends up getting synthesized by Thomas Aquinas into Christian theology, and how that then is received into the development of post-Reformed orthodoxy, or what we think of today now as Calvinism. So when you start seeing, or when you start studying the history of interpretation, you start studying historical theology, it opens your eyes to that there's a development of the history of ideas, that ideas have development behind them. They're not just these naked things that fall out of the heavens. And so when you can start tracing the development of theological ideas, you start getting an understanding of how Aristotle's unmoved mover correlates to Thomas Aquinas's conception of pure being, and how that relates to then an articulation of who or what God is for Thomas, and then how that's received again into Reformed orthodoxy. So once I started to realize that I could critically engage with these various developments theologically, because I started to understand and grasp the history of ideas that stood behind them, and I gained this kind of distanciation, it's called, where you can stand back and critically engage with the development of theological ideas. It gave me like some calm finally in my mind, because it brought order, right, to my mind and my thinking about things, because I still dealt with issues of like assurance of salvation. That's a pastoral thing. So I ended up writing a chapter for our second book on assurance of salvation. That's why I did that. My dad, a pastor, he was a retired pastor, but he dealt with lots of things. And one thing that messed him up hard was assurance of salvation. The enemy got a foothold in his life, and it literally, that's the fear of not being assured, literally destroyed my dad's life. So that's why these things are personal for me as well. I think ideas, theological ideas, any ideas, have real life consequences, no matter whether we're conscious of the idea itself or not, right? So that's why all of this for me is a personal thing. It's part of my Christian life and existence before God. And so I become passionate about things like this. I become passionate about issues like assurance of salvation. I want to know where some of this teaching, like there's no mystic or legal teaching on the understanding and reception of the gospel, where does that come from? Well, it comes from Aristotle. People would say that might be reductionistic, but it's really not. When you start studying the history of ideas, and when you have scholars, the most infamous, the authority for a lot of people, Richard Muller, calling that whole development Christian Aristotelianism. Whether you want to accept that or not, that's the reality. And so that bleeds then in to the shaping of federal or covenantal theology, the covenant of works, covenant of grace, covenant of redemption. You have the Pactum Salutis, you have the practical syllogism, you have what's called in the Puritan theology, especially experimental predestinarianism. This is very nomistic theology, because you think of God in a God-world relationship, a God-world relation, you think of him as being untouched. He has to remain untouched by his creation, or he's no longer impassible. He's no longer immutable. If he moves, if he has emotion, if God has passions, then he now somehow has become less than God. He's changed. He has movement in him. And so in order to protect that concept of God, you have to develop a system of decrees, right? That God relates to the world through decrees. He doesn't relate to the world personally per se. He relates to us through decrees. And by creating that buffer between the world and God, God remains holy, transcendent, unmoved, impassible, immutable, simple. And then he's still able, somehow he relates to us though through these decrees. And he does so arbitrarily. We don't really know why. He just does because he wants to, right? That gets pushed into a development of a doctrine of predestination, double predestination, where God decrees some are elect and most are either passively or actively passed over, and they're reprobate. They have no chance or hope to ever come to Christ. They have no hope of redemption. So, and then that gets bled, that develops further into the lives of Christian people who sit under the teaching of people like John MacArthur, James White, Matthew Barrett, Craig Carter, and all these other guys out there, Swain, Allen, teaching Reformed theology, no matter what their understanding of it, no matter what they accept about its background and its development, when it gets fleshed out through the pulpits, eventually, as these pastors have been trained at Reformed Theological Seminary, and now Grace, I think what's it called, Grace Baptist Bible Seminary, something like that. That's where James White is at now, the one Strachan, something they just started, Jeff Johnson. So these guys are training pastors. I mean, yeah, this has been going on for a long time. And then, of course, that theology, however that particular pastor receives it, whatever their understanding of it is, whatever emphases they grab onto and hold on to, they communicate that through their exegesis of Scripture, right? That informs their biblical exegetical conclusions. They teach it as if it's the gospel truth, this understanding of God who relates to us through these law-like decretal ways, through that mechanism. And then that emphasis of who God is comes through to the people, and it's watered down even more, but they might grab onto these hooks, right? And the hook basically is that God is this legal jurist, right, in the heavens. And you better hope that he actually did elect you. And even if this language, election, things like that, even if they don't use that language, even if it's just coming through willy-nilly evangelical teaching, these emphases, these categories are still present in very discombobulated ways. But they're still there. And this notion of God as this kind of forensic lawgiver comes through, and people then struggle. And that's what my dad struggled with, right? I mean, and I got to talk to my dad, went to be with the Lord 2 years ago now. And he died a death of despair, right? I mean, and it does tie back. His despair does tie back to bad theology. So again, this is very personal for me. But I try to stay objective as well, as much as possible, as far as the critical work goes, and thinking about these things historically, and thinking about their impact theologically. So, yeah, that's for me then the state. If I'm going to reduce this into a discussion on the state of Reformed theology, it hasn't changed. It's the same. And it's worse, in my estimation, because of the internet and its dissemination therefrom. And so lots of people, of course, you had the young, restless Reformed movement. What's his name? Colin Hansen coined that language, and I think he wrote a book titled that, and that was picked up on. That was, that was like the last decade. That was pretty popular. And now that seems to be dying off, the young, restless Reformed. a lot of those people become disillusioned with that. A lot of them get into that world. They meet a God who they, is very regimented and seems pretty intellectualist, right? That's another aspect of this. The God's pure rationality, pure intellect, the big brain in the sky. But that doesn't meet our need. That's not the wisdom of God that we encounter through the cross of Jesus Christ, that we encounter through God's self-revelation in Jesus Christ, in the manger, in his lived life, particularly in his public ministry, eventuating in the cross. That's God's wisdom. That's who God is. In God's humanity in Christ, he humbled himself that he might exalt us with him in the resurrection. And he assumed all of our humanity, right? What other humanity was there to assume in election? I've asked, you can ask classically Calvinist or Reformed people that. They've never even thought about it like that most often. They don't think about this idea that, so he assumed the elect humanity. Well, then what if so there's like a pre-redemption, right? Then Jesus is just going through the motions when he comes here, when he's working under the conditions of the decree. This is the other fundamental problem with decretal theology like that, Aristotelian theology, let's just call it that for now. When Jesus enters into the world in the manger, in Mary's womb, and he's assumed apparently just the elect humanity, because that's who he came to die for, right? Just those elect people who God arbitrarily elected. But that's already been, like, you have superlapsarianism, you have infralapsarianism, and that's relative to the absolute decree, right? And how things are ordered. So whatever way you go with that, it's still an issue of this all chronologically is pre-temporal, right? This is all predestined. What Christ came to do with predestined. They chose to arbitrarily elect some people to come and die for those people, to resurrect for those people, and eventually to eternally justify those people. And so, but then Jesus, this is again the problem though, is he enters into the world under those conditions, and it's no longer what he's doing is no longer necessarily related to the person of the triune God. When he's meeting the conditions of this decree, when he's meeting the conditions of the covenant of works in federal theology, he becomes an instrument, like a demiurge, like you find in Gnosticism. He becomes a mediator, but subordinate mediator. Like his person doesn't matter at that point. The fact that he's God doesn't necessarily matter. He's carrying out the conditions of this decree instead. So, yeah, I'm rambling. I could talk about this if we were talking face to face. It'd be better. Anybody watching this, but I don't think I have anything left to say. I'll just say this: to me, the state of Reformed theology is what it always has been and always will be. From my perspective, when I'm trying to critique it or challenge it from my vantage point as an evangelical Calvinist, as Athanasian Reformed, doing work thinking after Thomas Torrance, Richard Sibbes, even Karl Barth, others like that in that Reformed tradition itself. When I'm trying to engage with people, I'm not under the false illusion that machine that I'm coming up against will ever be dismantled. It never will. But it's just like doing evangelism, and I'm an evangelist at heart. It's just like doing evangelism in the church, for the church. The church needs to be evangelized, and so that's kind of the way I approach these things. I just know that there's pastors out there who I'm making aware of some of this stuff and it's helping them. So I've gotten that kind of feedback. And what about John? You say, what about Robert Jensen? I mean, he's Lutheran. My friend John Hoyam just finished his PhD on an aspect of Jensen's theology at Aberdeen. Like that was just like within the last month or two, and I've gained some good insights from Jensen. And I mean, I read his systematic theology and some other books from him in the past, but I like with him, I just like his focus on narratival type theology. So yeah, he's kind of like he is working in that kind of after Bart, post Bartian tradition too, and as a Lutheran. So of course he brings his own kind of approach to things, but that's for me in general. That's how I like, or that's what I like about Jensen in a general way, is just that he's focused on kind of like this. Some people call it post-metaphysical, like, but it's really, I don't think it's post-metaphysical. I don't think Bart's post-metaphysical. I think he has a metaphysics of divine freedom operative in his theology, and I think that, but I think the point is that we're focusing on knowing God as God's revealed himself in the economy, in God's economy in Jesus Christ. And that's the focus. That's the emphasis of Jensen as well. Sticking to the text, but not in like a naive kind of James White or MacArthurite way, but sticking to the text of Scripture, allowing the emphases of Scripture, allowing the questions that are provided for us in Scripture and the implications of the incarnation itself, allowing those to determine and dictate the shape of his theology, the way that he attempted to talk about the Trinity and time and things like that. So, people say he's incoherent. People say Bart's incoherent, that Torrance is incoherent in their theological projects because they aren't scholastic. That's really what they're saying, that they don't have that, or even analytic kind of precision, like analytic theology is attempting to do, I guess, nowadays. But yeah, I generally like Jensen, and for those general reasons. I don't particularly like if we got specific, I don't like Jensen's understanding. I've written about this in the blog of the way he talks about the resurrection of Jesus. It's kind of like Gnostic. It sounds kind of like the way that what's his name, Hart, David Bentley Hart talks about the resurrection. It's very Gnostic sounding to me. It's like not physical. It's like this kind of spiritual body resurrection. So, that's where I don't like Jensen. But in general, like I just said, I like him because of his more narratival approach to doing theology, which basically just means attempting to stick to this storyline of the Bible and allowing those emphases and categories as they find reality in Jesus to determine the shape of the kind of theologizing he did. And so that's where I would go with Jensen in a like nutshell and in general. So, and my mentor, Dr. Ron Frost, my historical theology professor and ethics professor in seminary, he really liked Robert Jensen. So I was introduced to Jensen back in 2002, I guess, in seminary. And I started reading him a little bit then. I've read him more since then. But yeah, that's what I like about Jensen in general. So I don't really have anything else just to ramble about. I mean, I do, but I'm really rambling, and I'm kind of getting hungry too. So, John, I think you're my only viewer right now. So if you have anything else you want to ask me real quick, or you just want to discuss real quick through this venue, then you could ask me right now before I close this down. But it's already gone over an hour. But yeah, thanks for anybody who watched this. Thanks, John, for engaging with me here. That always helps when people engage with me, ask questions. Helps me not to ramble so much. And there's always more to say. You can find me at my blog always at growrag.wordpress.com. Growrag, GROWRAG.wordpress.com. It's the Athanasian Reform blog. I have lots of stuff, millions of words written there. You can go through the categories. I had one guy actually, or no, I think at least two guys I know of have read my whole blog, which is kind of crazy to me. But they've read my whole blog, and so you can do that. Make that your New Year's resolution. And there's just a lot there. So, anyways, there's categories at the blog you can work through, and different topics, and just see what I think about things. That's usually how I blog. I'm just thinking off the top, typically engaging with stuff that I read. Something stands out to me. What would be a good intro reading list? Like, John, so like from anybody in particular? Do you mean like in general, like theologically, other than the blog? Well, for me, I'll just speak from me, from my perspective. I think my way in is always more historical theology than even systematic theology. So the book that we use is dated now, but it's still really good, that we used in our Reformation theology class is called The Age of Reform. I've mentioned it before. The Age of Reform by Stephen Osmond. That kind of got me into the whole historical theology world, and it's really good for that. And it works through Luther, it works through scholasticism, the basics on Calvinism. Yeah, you have to be specific with me here. Well, that book would be read The Age of Reform by Stephen Osmond. It's an introductory work. It's intended to be used as an introductory work, and you will learn about the background. That's how I started understanding the background of Calvinism. Its historical antecedents in late medieval theology. That's where Calvinism developed out of. So if you don't understand that, then you're not going to you'll never understand Calvinism. And you're saying evangelical Calvinism. I thought you were saying even Calvinism. Okay, so basics on evangelical Calvinism. Yeah, start with the Age of Reform, because that's the problem that we've had with evangelical Calvinism. It requires a lot of background first in understanding classical, like so-called classical Calvinism, because it developed contemporaneous to the development of what we think of as Calvinism today. So unless you have that background in that context, and that's really the burden of evangelical Calvinism still, for me and others who want to do that, but is to provide people. You have to come up to speed with quite a bit of stuff in order for evangelical Calvinism itself, at least as far as an alternative and even then a critique of federal theology. For that to make sense, you have to really understand covenantal theology, federal theology, pretty well. You have to understand its antecedents pretty well, and most people don't. And so it's made the reception of our so-called evangelical Calvinism harder. It makes it kind of academic almost because of that, because a lot of people are unaware, like I was talking about earlier with James White, MacArthurites, at the church level, like that level. Most people have no background. They don't even. MacArthur doesn't. He doesn't understand that stuff. So in order for evangelical Calvinism to make sense in a kind of a depth way, you first have to really understand Calvinism really well, and federal theology, covenantal theology in particular, because Barth and Torrance, that's who they're interacting with. That's who they're critiquing. That's who they're offering. That's not their direct interlocutors, classical Calvinism like that. But that is when they do engage with Reformed theology, that's who they're engaging with. Like they're not engaging with John MacArthur. They're not engaging with any Baptist Calvinists. They're engaging with federal Reformed covenantal theology. And so you have to understand that stuff in order for what they're doing to make sense too. And that same goes for evangelical Calvinism. So yeah, like a lot of pushback I've gotten about evangelical Calvinism is it just doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. And I'm talking about people in the churches. I'm not talking people like Scott Swain and Allen and Kevin Van Hooser, academics who've engaged with evangelical Calvinist stuff in their writings. They responded to it and us because, yeah, they're steeped. They understand the antecedents of their federal covenantal theology and classical Calvinism. And so the evangelical Calvinism that we're offering in a positive sense and then in a negative sense, as far as the critique goes itself, the federal classical covenantal theology hits more home with guys like that and gals like that than it does with people sitting in the pews under MacArthur or James White or people like that. So yeah, I would just say you have to come up to speed. Maybe I'll do a blog post, John, on offering like an intro reading list to get people up to speed on understanding classical Calvinism first before we get into evangelical Calvinism, because evangelical Calvinism is a cousin of that stuff in a way. And so it won't make any sense to people unless they have background. So that's the way, yeah, that's what I would say about that. So, and then the basics of evangelical Calvinism, well, it's pretty, the way that Mike Habitz and I have presented evangelical Calvinism is it's unique. It's unique. So, so you can read our two books. You can read what we read first was Thomas Torrance's book, Scottish Theology. That'd be really helpful for you as far as the historic antecedents of evangelical Calvinism. And then you can get into English. Yeah, you gotta get our books. You can get the Kindle. That's how they're cheapest. If you get Kindle, they're $9.99. If you don't, they're expensive now. They're more expensive than they were when they first came out. They're like $50 each. So Kindle probably the best way to go. They're $9.99 on Kindle. If you have Kindle, I hope. So, but yeah, Thomas Torrance's book, Scottish Theology, and then just understand Torrance's theology in general. But that's where, so Scottish Theology and his book, School of Faith. Those are the two books that I would recommend from Torrance to understand where we're coming from with evangelical Calvinism. And his book, Scottish Theology, is where we got the language of evangelical Calvinism from. That's what he uses in contrast to, what he calls Westminster Calvinism or things like that. So yeah, that's where I would go, John, to get that background on evangelical Calvinism and then understand covenant federal theology. And the way I began to understand it was to read people like Richard Muller and all those guys, and the history itself, and understanding some Puritan theology and patristic theology. I would read J.N.D. Kelly's book, Introduction to Early Christian Doctrine, I think it's called. That's a book we use for patristic theology in seminary, and it's still really good for introductory purposes. So I would, go read J.N.D. J.N. That's just N.D. initials, Kelly. So I'd read that for patristics. I'd read on Thomas. When you read Torrance on patristic theology, he does good. I mean, he understands patristic theology. He did his PhD on grace and the apostolic fathers. So he's like a patristic theologian. But when you read him on patristic theology, it's kind of like reading. He's always doing constructive. He's constructive. So he's not doing he's not trying to do pure history per se. He's doing good theological history, but it's kind of hagiography. I can't even say it right now. It's hagiography. He's kind of blending maybe some Barthian themes with his reading of the patristics and things like that. But you can read his Trinitarian Faith is where you would get the best of Torrance on patristic theology, his Trinitarian Faith. And then also his book, Christian Doctrine of God, where that's not purely patristic, but he engages with patristics there too. So, but I'd say go to J.N.D. Kelly first. That's my go-to guy for introductory purposes. And then you can read Donald Fairbairn He's a patristic scholar. Anything he's written is excellent. So I'd recommend anything by Donald Fairbairn. He teaches at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And so, yeah, those are my quick recommendations for introductory stuff. John Baer, his book on the way to Nicaea. He has 2 volumes. Those are good. And then my friend's book, maybe you're friends with him. I don't know, John, on Facebook, Alex Irving. It's excellent. I wrote a commendation for it. It's called We Believe. And he's engaging with it's excellent. Actually, I recommend that even over Jane D. Kelly. So get Alex Irving's book called We Believe, and it's excellent. And he goes through, and it's intended to be an introductory. It's deeper, but it's introductory too. But it's really good, and he works through all of that, the development of Trinitarian theology after Nicaea and during Nicaea. So. Get Alex's book for sure, Alex Irving. So I think I'm going to end it. I'm hungry. So thanks again, John, for being in here with me. And anybody else who watches this later on YouTube, thanks for watching. And I'll see you next time. All right. Bye.